Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for attending the LEAF Spring Panel. My name is Joanna Guy, and I'm a graduate student in the Gender and Social Justice program with the Department of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Alberta. Our topic for today is reproductive justice, successes and challenges in Canada and internationally. Today, we will feature speakers who will discuss happenings in Ireland, Argentina, and Canada. We are very grateful that our speakers today have given us their time. Before we go any further, I wish to express my gratitude to the diverse Indigenous peoples of Treaty 6 under the document signed on August 23rd, 1876, on the site now known as Edmonton. The Indigenous peoples who have ties to the territory on which we gather to learn, share, and inspire. I know their contributions and achievements in the development of the region. I specifically want to acknowledge the harm inflicted on Indigenous peoples, their communities, their nations, and their cultures. I would like to take a moment to thank the individuals who were on the organizing committee for this event. Dr. Lise Gotel, Jennifer Tomaszewski, Joanne Gnomes, Danielle Paradis, Tiffany Stokes, Jessica Chapman, and myself. Today, we will hear from each of our speakers in turn. This will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Dr. Lise Gotel. Some housekeeping items. Throughout the presentations, the panel, you can pose questions to the panelists in the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be addressed during the panel. Both the question section and the chat will be monitored by committee members. Now to introduce our panelists. Dr. Katerina Yahyaoui. Prior to joining NUI Galloway in 2012, Katerina taught and researched at the University of Montreal, Canada. She's an expert in various dimensions of human rights and international law. In particular, she is widely published and internationally recognized specialist in feminist legal approaches, gender and human rights, and international women's rights. Most recently, she published a monograph discussing the limitations and possibilities of the concept of gender in international human rights law. She also published on such issues as Islamic veiling, female genital surgeries, equality or violence against women, to name just a few. In 2016, she was the recipient of the NUI Galloway President's Award for Research Excellence. On several occasions, she was selected as an external expert for the evaluation of various projects within EU Horizon 2020 program. She is an active member of the European Society of International Law, where she was elected to the coordinating committee of the International Group on International Legal Theory and Philosophy, as well as to the role of chair of the said group. Katerina is a former director of postgraduate thought programs of the Irish Centre for Human Rights and the current vice dean for research in the College of Business, Public Policy, and Law. Marcela Basch. Marcela Basch is a journalist, a teacher based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She founded a website and co-founded an international conference focused on collaborative economics and culture in Latin America. The conference, titled Commons and convened over several years, included discussions on feminism and reproductive rights. She was part of the planning team of Assembly Women, a one-day festival on women's rights held at the Cervantes National Theater in Buenos Aires, and she has been a radio columnist on gender. Dr. Kerri Froc. Kerri is an associate professor at UNB Law, as well as Trudeau and Vernier Scholar. She has taught courses at Carleton University, Queen's University, and University of Ottawa on feminist legal theory and various aspects of public law, among others. Kerri received her PhD from Queen's University in 2016 and holds a Master of Laws from the University of Ottawa, a Bachelor's of Law from Osgoode Hall Law School, and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Regina. Before completing her doctorate, she spent 18 years as a lawyer, as a civil litigator in Regina, a staff lawyer for the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, LEAF, as well as staff lawyer in the areas of law reform, equality at the Canadian Bar Association. She is a member of the Saskatchewan and Ontario bars. Dr. Lise Gotell is a professor in the Faculty of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Alberta. She has kindly agreed to moderate today's panel. Over to you, Dr. Gotell.
Good morning, everyone. It's a lovely day here in Edmonton, and while the pandemic has imposed many limitations on our ability to gather, it has certainly enabled these wonderful international interactions of the kind that we're going to have today. I also wanted to say Happy Equality Day. This is the anniversary of the day that the equality rights provisions of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into effect. So our panelists today will be speaking in turn, and this will be followed by a panel where you get to pose questions and comments to the panelists. The Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, will be open throughout the panelist talk, and so feel free to put comments or questions into the panel as they're into the Q&A as they're speaking. So we're going to proceed in the following order. Ekaterina will speak first, then Marcela, and then Kerri. So over to you, Ekaterina.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me. So I will start sharing my presentation first of all. Okay, can you see it? Yeah, is it? Okay, so I was asked to talk about reproductive justice, access and challenges, and of course in Ireland, because I'm based at the NUA Galway, National University of Ireland in Galway. And so in order to talk to you about what constitutes successes and challenges in Ireland, I think it is important that I first present to you a little bit of the historical background of the development in Irish context. And one thing first, which I need to mention, is that of course, all the discussions about reproductive justice in Ireland are very much dominated by the Catholic religion and Catholic tradition in Ireland. So many things are explainable from that perspective. But what I present when I talk about historical context, it's important to understand how these issues of reproductive justice are embedded in the legislation and the type of conversations we have about reproductive justice in Ireland. And so the starting point is this very old Offences Against the Person Act, which penalized abortion basically for women and for people who might potentially assist women with life sentence. And this was the law in Ireland for a very long time. And despite the biggest sort of challenge which happened is that despite the existence of such a harsh punishment already in law, those who were against choice by women wanted to have a stronger protection against any possible opportunity to legalize abortion and wanted a constitutional provision. So the story starts, and that's a very important part of the story in Ireland, with this 1983 referendum, which introduced 8th Amendment to the Irish Constitution, which, as you can see in the text here, placed the life of the unborn child and the life of the mother at the same level. So I reproduced here this text because it's very important to keep it in mind as I continue with the presentation. And so another important element of this is that despite the fact that the text places the life of the mother and unborn child at the same level, actually what happened is that very often lives of mothers were neglected. And so we will see how it played out. So the whole fight for the reproductive justice up until recently, very recently in Ireland, was to get rid of this amendment in the Irish constitution, because otherwise, of course, legislature cannot introduce any type of legislation which would allow for abortion in any form. You will see in a moment why I say in any form, because what happens with the next referendum in '92, which is triggered by this X case, is that there's a situation. X case, it's a minor girl who was victim of rape. As a result of rape, she became pregnant, and she was suicidal. She wanted to travel to get abortion, because of course in Ireland abortion being prohibited, many women travel basically to the UK to get abortions in situations where they needed it. And so she was prevented by the High Court initially from traveling. And then the Supreme Court, actually looking at the text of this 8th Amendment, said if we value equally the life of the mother and the fetus, we actually have to allow, in this particular case, the travel, because otherwise we will lose both the life and the mother, the life of the mother and the life of the fetus. And this was received very negatively by those portions of the populations who, as I said to you, were viewing this provision as being actually a stronger protection for the life of the fetus. Because in this particular situation, there was a very important portion of the population who who thought that the judges of the Supreme Court, who ultimately allowed this travel, were not right. And so in the case of suicide, they said it shouldn't be allowed to have abortions. So this case triggered this another important referendum. And actually, I don't mention all the referenda here because there were some others which are related to this issue. I mentioned just the 3 most important ones. And during this referendum, 3 amendments were proposed. And the first of this, which was not accepted by Irish population, would prevent women from traveling and getting abortions in case of suicide. So basically it would be the same provision which places the life of mother and the fetus at the same level, which allows in case of a threat to the life of the mother for abortions, but not in case of suicide. So this was not accepted. This was 12th Amendment, which was rejected. But 13th and 14th Amendments were adopted, which allowed women to travel, which clearly stated the possibility for women to travel between Ireland and another state. And another important achievement which happens with this referendum is that a 14th Amendment provides possibility for receiving information about abortions and information about possibilities to travel to other states. Because until 1992, until this referendum, even simple provision of information was not possible in Ireland. So theoretically, what happens in 1992 is that legislator could legislate and somehow regulate better and explain in what cases, when the life of the mother is in danger, abortion could be possible. But this doesn't happen until 2013, because in Ireland there was a lot of reluctance to discuss this issue. And as I mentioned at the beginning, despite the statement of equal value of lives, it was not equal. It was really, you can see in practice that it was the life of the fetus that sometimes counted more. And what again triggered this adoption of at least some legislation in 2013, Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, was again another case which was very serious and very revolting to many. It was a case of a woman Indian woman living here in Ireland, who was 16 weeks pregnant, and she came to hospital because she was feeling unwell, and she was diagnosed with incomplete miscarriage. But instead of completing and helping her to complete this miscarriage, doctors didn't want to do anything because heartbeat of the fetus was still detectable. And so after a few days in the hospital, she died. You can see here how, again, doctors know what is happening. They know that the fetus will die at the end, but they are not doing anything because they are still fearing so much, because the threat for them, in case they do something more than what is allowed, is life imprisonment. But also the reports about this case say that the woman and her husband were told that you are in a Catholic country. We will not give you abortion or provide you with abortion service. So there was a lot of organizing around after this case and around this case in general. Civil society, so sort of movements were formed. Most importantly, also those movements which later on resulted in the repeal of the Eighth Amendment. And during this time, they adopted this Protection of Life after the case in 2013, Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, which tried to regulate somehow how women can get abortion in case there's a threat to a woman's life. But it was really a very complicated process, but at the same time, a process which was not very efficient. It still had also a provision for criminalizations of abortions. The punishment was changed to 14 years imprisonment, but it was still a punishment for both women and those helping them, so basically for doctors. And so it was viewed as not what women wanted. So it's definitely not that reproductive justice which they were seeking. And I think this case and many other cases which were happening around this time, also in the European Court of Human Rights, in other human rights treaty monitoring bodies, helped mobilize public opinion to organize for this referendum and get a yes vote. I will not go into detail of how this happened exactly, also because of the limited time. But it's important how this accumulation of different cases led people to finally win in this referendum. So basically 36th Amendment to the Irish Constitution in 2018 repealed the 8th Amendment and allowed the legislator to introduce legislation which will regulate abortion. So that's the basic sense of this amendment. So it allowed legislation to legislate on abortion. And then, of course, very quickly after that was adopted this Health Regulation Termination of Pregnancy Act, which is now in force since January 1st, 2019. For Ireland, the existence of this act is a big success. If you look at the history of how the issue was difficult to negotiate up until now. So I will say a few words about the contents of this act, but then I will talk about challenges which are still remaining. And for those of you coming from countries which are sort of have these issues more, or let's say more freely regulated, it might seem very restrictive what we have in Ireland now. But for Ireland, what we have, on the one hand, is seen as a success, but on the other hand, of course, it is. There are still many challenges, and people who work on reproductive justice, and especially civil society organizations, understand this. So what we have now are these 4 different cases in which abortion is allowed. First of all, if there's a risk to life or health, and health has to be, in relation to health, it's serious harm to health. So that's how it is defined. Then this, and in this case, I say it here on the slide, you need certification from 2 medical practitioners. If there's an emergency, this is a different story. There is a need for certification only from 1 practitioner. So it's immediate risk to life or serious health issue. Then the third case, in conditions which are likely to lead to death of fetus, including within 20 days of birth. This is another possibility. And again, there is a procedure for certification by 2 medical practitioners. And then there's early pregnancy, abortion in early pregnancy. In this case, what the Act says is that the pregnancy shall not exceed 12 weeks of pregnancy, and the term of pregnancy is calculated from the first day of the last menstrual period. And another thing which is introduced in relation to early pregnancy is that after the first certification, women or pregnant people have to wait no less than 3 days before being able to access abortion. And this question with the waiting period, you know, when the Act was proposed from there were different groups which worked on this, and even the parliamentary committee was against this waiting period, but the final Act adopted was with the waiting period, because again, of these conservative forces, there's really a fight for every single small, you know, achievement or step. And this was not, the 3-day waiting period was really an outcome of adoption by the parliament, within the parliament itself, and where conservative forces sort of tried to control women's reproductive rights as much as possible. So the Act, of course, has a review process, but it also has its shortcomings. If somebody is interested, I can explain this. Then consensual objections are accepted from doctors, but they have then to direct women to another practitioner. And offences are still kept in this Act, and they are still punishable with up to 14 years of imprisonment, but women themselves are not punishable anymore, because under the all previous Acts, women were also punishable for these offences, but now they are not. However, for doctors, of course, it creates a very important chilling effect in some situations. So, like if you compare the current Act with what existed previously in Ireland, of course you understand why for Ireland it's celebrated. Until today it's viewed as a big success in terms of reproductive rights. However, at the same time, civil society organizations are highlighting many challenges within the existing framework, because of course, you see what is happening in Ireland is that I will mention in a moment these challenges, but the whole situation is viewed not in terms so much of reproductive rights for women and sort of introducing more freedom for women, but as a freedom which is introduced for the legislature to do something to allow women and to regulate how women or pregnant people behave, and not so much really a talk about reproductive justice. That's how the law was introduced, that's how all the debates are going on at the political level. Of course, within the civil society, the discourse is different, but from sort of politicians, the dominant discourse is really about controlling women and controlling people who are getting pregnant, and trying not to let them do too much. So the challenges which are highlighted in relation to this existing Act, of course, waiting period, which I already mentioned, which coupled with the procedure itself, how it is performed, makes it very difficult for many people to respect this 12 weeks period, even if they are really, because it becomes so long that 12 weeks pass very quickly, and especially because they are counted from the first day of the last period. Then this terminology of immediate danger, remember, to health or life, seriousness of the danger for health, then there's extraordinary in relation to one element of the act, which are obviously very subjective. There are some guidelines for medical practitioners in this regard, but still what I mentioned, this continuing criminalization, which is my next point, for doctors, makes them very, very cautious in doing anything, because of course they don't want to be subject to such a harsh and severe punishment. And so these subjective terms coupled with continuing criminalization make the doctors usually will make the most conservative decisions. Conscientious objections, but this is an issue not only in Ireland. Then another interesting point, which remains a challenge in Ireland, is this terminology of women, which is used through the Act. And from the beginning, even before the adoption of the Act, civil society organizations were highlighting it's so easy just to use the term a pregnant person. But the Act uses the term women throughout. Another challenge is accessibility in terms of especially geographic accessibility of services, because the way medical services, if somebody is interested, I provide here link to the official website of the Health Service Executive. But just to give you a sense, in Ireland, there are 19 hospitals with maternity departments, and only 10 of these opted into this provision of abortions. So, which means for many people trying to access abortions, they will have to travel quite long distance. And imagine people from impoverished backgrounds, from rural background, Ireland. It will make it very hard and difficult, and sometimes even impossible if they cannot get, because also public transportation is not necessarily the best one in some areas, and then as I say, it will make it impossible for people to get access to the service. And especially 12 weeks goes so quickly, because also it's not from the first day that women or people know that they are pregnant. And then the whole process of abortion requires at least 3 visits. It can be more depending on how it goes on, but it's at least 3 visits. And then also, of course, I mentioned it at the beginning, but the continuing stigmatization of people accessing abortions is still a recurrent issue. Of course, there are other challenges, but these are the main ones which are highlighted constantly. So I will conclude just by saying again that, of course, at this moment, where after so many decades of advocacy, those who fought for this win in Ireland in terms of reproductive justice are, of course, celebrating and are happy with this win. But at the same time, looking at how the law is applied, how the reality actually unfolds for women, many more challenges are coming ahead. And I think it's still very hard to talk in Ireland about reproductive justice. It's still a negotiation between just for women to get to be recognized and for pregnant people to be recognized as full individuals and as individuals who can make their own decisions. It's still not a talk about reproductive justice, is significantly below that line where you can really talk in terms of justice. Okay, so I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Next, we'll move on to Marcela.
Hi, it's very nice for me to be here today with you. And I'm telling you the story of what we call in Argentina the green tide or the green wave. I'll share my screen to you because I'd like to share some pictures to illustrate my words. So let's see. Is it okay, Liz? Yes? Okay, great. So I'd like you to look at these girls. They are very, very young. They are literally schoolgirls. They should be, I don't know, 15 or 16 or 14. And this is June 14, 2018. And they are on the street. They are in front of the Congress in Buenos Aires, and they are waiting for the votation for the bill for abortion. I look at those faces, and I cannot help thinking of myself when I was 15, when I earned my first money, small money, like typing some things for my dad. I saved it, and I've saved my first earnings on those years because back there in the 90s, I thought that me or my friends might need that money for an abortion. So we didn't even have sex life at that point in our lives, but that was on our minds, that could happen. We could need an abortion, and that could be problematic. So these girls were there on the streets, and they were not alone. Look at this. There was 1 million people on the streets on 2018 pushing for this abortion law. I was there myself with my friends. I'd like to show you, if you can see it, the t-shirt I got there. It says, you see it? It says será ley in Spanish. That means it's gonna be law. It's gonna be law. I also had, well, I had my wig, my green wig. You can see it maybe, like this. I was like this on the streets. We were all on the streets, as you can see, 1 million people. But the most important thing, the most important symbol we had, it wasn't the wig. It's not that we're all using green wigs there. It was this, the green scarf or handkerchief, as you can see. I'll show it here because you'll see it more clearly. It says, I'm translating, it says national campaign for the right for abortion, legal, safe, and free abortion. And then in the smaller words, in the smaller letters, it says sex education to decide, contraceptives to avoid abortion, and legal abortion to avoid dying, to avoid death. So this is the scarf. This is the symbol of the fight for abortion in Argentina. I'll go to the end of the story very quickly to let you know that we finally got our law in 2020, in last December, but the whole movement got momentum, a very important momentum in 2018. In 2018, we had, I think, hundreds of these manifestations that we call pañuelazos, that comes from the word pañuelo, which is the Spanish word for handkerchief or scarf. And the pañuelazos were these demonstrations where we were all saying, we need abortion now, legal, safe, free abortion now. We had those pañuelazos all over Argentina, which is a very big country, and also in other countries. I'll show you later pictures of pañuelazos in very, very different places in the world. These were in the framework of the Martes Verdes, which is Green Tuesdays. Every Tuesday, Congress, almost every Tuesday of the year, the Congress were discussing in different commissions, discussing the issue of abortion. There were people from the civil society speaking for and against legal abortion. So outside the Congress and in many cities in the country, we had these Green Tuesdays where we had art, poetry, music, theater, dancing, and of course, pañuelazos all the time, showing our green scarves like this and shouting. Sex education to decide, and sex education to decide. I'm forgetting here the words in English. Contraceptives not to abort, and legal abortion not to die. So you can see it was a very, very massive movement. It wasn't an activist movement. It wasn't just the feminist just the people who was already mobilized. It was millions of people on the street. That was the very, very powerful thing. I'm not an activist, really. I mean, I'm just a woman who was there as we all were there, millions of us. So what I wanted to tell you now is how this happened, because it wasn't overnight. It wasn't just something that blew up in 2018, just like Katerina was explaining in the case of Ireland, which is, I felt very reflected. So this picture is from 1984. In 1984, this was the International Women's Day in 8 March. The democracy in Argentina had only 3 months because we had a very, very bloody dictatorship, I'm sorry, that was during from 1976 to 1983, and the Democratic president was in charge in December 83, so this was March. This is the Congress, again, the same from the other picture, and look at these women. This woman, this sign is saying no to motherhood, yes to pleasure, 1984. This sign is saying machismo, sexism is fascism. This one is saying divorce is a right and freedom to choose, because back then we didn't have legal divorce in Argentina yet. We had it in the years to come, and in the 80s. This sign says, my body is mine, no more deaths on abortions, because of abortions. This one says, pleasure is revolutionary. I love this one. So these women start to organize themselves, and they put up the first national women meeting. And this was in the 86. This woman, her name is Mabel Bellucci, was there, and she remembers that there were about 1,000 women on that meeting. And she said in the interview where I got this picture, she said, this year, and that was 2019, this year we are going to be 200,000 women in the national meeting. Of course, that was the last one, the 34 one, because after that, you know, pandemic, we couldn't do that anymore. So this is a story. This is 1992, and I think this is the same woman, I think, Mabel Bellucci, she looks like. And this is the very same corner where you have seen the young little girls at the beginning. It's in front of the Congress. It's a very important corner. And they were there in 1992, just handling flyers to the people discussing terms of the right of abortion. And if you take a look to the sign, it says contraceptive to avoid abortion and abortion to avoid dying. So this is already 2003. In one of these national meetings of women in a big Buenos Aires, they finally discussed for the first time the idea of a legal abortion, to take that to the Congress. And then they put up the first massive march for the right of abortion, and that was 2003. In 2005 started the campaign, the national campaign for the right to have a legal, safe, and free abortion. And if you look at the smaller letters, they say 2005, 2020, we are still on campaign because there are so many other rights to conquer yet. So this woman, she's the mother of the other woman who's in the sign. The woman in the sign was called Ana Maria Acevedo. She was a poor woman, and she was a mother of 2, and she had cancer. So when she went to the hospital to be treated because she had cancer, the doctors discovered that she was pregnant. So they refused to give her chemotherapy, and she died. She's one of the martyrs of this fight. We always remember her name, Ana Maria Acevedo. So in 2007, I think, these people, it says lesbians and feminists for the decriminalization of abortion, they had an idea. They understood that people need support to be able to abort, because backstreet abortion was too risky. People were dying. So they put up this phone line, this just a cell phone line, to give information about abortion. And the sign says, abortion, more information, less risks, because they started to have information, and they started to have information about how to have an abortion with pills, a medical abortion without kerosene. Because in Brazil, the people were using pills to abort. So that information started to come to Argentina in a very informal way, and people said, okay, we should share this information. So 2 years later, the line was 2011, this is 2000, I'm sorry, the line was 2009, this is 2011. In 2011, they put up a manual, a first manual, on how to perform an abortion with pills. That's exactly the title you are seeing, how to perform an abortion with pills. And here in the yellow part, it says easy, cheap, safe, and at home like now in the lockdown. And they spread this very widely in feminist meetings, but also in any other human rights meetings, and also on the internet. They work a lot on this. So at this point, the campaign was already submitting the bills to the Congress. The first bill, the first draft, was submitted to the Congress in 2007, but it wasn't taken seriously. And then in 2008, and again in 2010, because in Argentina, every 2 years, the bills you submit just go down and you have to do it again. So they submitted the bill again in 2010 and 12 and 14 and 16 without getting tired. So inspired by this phone line that I show you, other people, what I'm trying to show here is how these grassroots movements grew momentum very slowly. And each woman learning on how other women had done, and each woman sharing with the others. So this group of women, they were women from the national campaign who learned from the lesbian and feminists who were putting up this phone line with their own resources, of course, their own very limited resources. And they put up a network of people who would help and support people who wanted to abort. The name in Spanish is Socorristas en Red, which means help and support network. And this network was decentralized, was in the different cities of the country, and they work decentralizedly, just attending the phone and saying, yes, I hear you, I'm with you, I can give information about how to abort. But not only that, because sometimes people would say, I'm all by myself, I'm scared, I don't know how to do this. And they would say, okay, go to the pharmacy, buy these pills, and then come back and call me, and I'll guide you, and I'll be with you on the phone. And it's a very much needed psychological support. They were doing that for free for years in an autogestive situation. And now, fortunately, the state took over, and the government is doing that. The Ministry of Health is doing that now, finally. But they started this because they could and they could. So this is just merchandising. Misoprostol is the drug that allows the abortion with pills. And you can see the pink wig. That's inspired on Italian feminists who started this kind of help and support networks and used this pink. So the pink is the color for these networks. So this was growing one layer up the other, and in 2015, a very big thing happened in Argentina, and it wasn't a happy thing. It was just, it was violence against women, it was femicide we all have faced, and a lot of them. At some point in 2015, there was a very horrible femicide, and a group of journalists said, we have to do something about this. And they proposed just a very, very big march to protest violence against women. And it was so huge. So much. It was the press, everyone. There were millions of people on the, and they were women that had never protested anything, you know. They were like new people on the streets, very, very young and very, very old, and different social classes. And that movement was called, as you can see there, Ni Una Menos, which translates as not one less, or not one fewer, I think, which means they said, Viva nos queremos, we want to be ourselves alive, we want to be alive. It was the most basic women's right, which is to be alive. They shout, stop killing us. It's a very, very basic thing. But this melded and merged with the whole feminist campaigns and work that was going on for years. And so this gave birth to a new feminism, much, 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 much bigger, that some people call feminism without a theoretical framework, you know, because these people, they were not studying feminism, they were just there on the streets reclaiming for their rights. This is where the green tide, I think, started with the Ni Una Menos. And all these years, the campaign was still submitting the bill every 2 years, and also the campaign was registering the episodes of violence against women and obstetric violence, and the women that were in jail because they had abortions or spontaneous abortions or miscarriages, or what they call obstetric events. And this was the case of this woman that we call Belen. That's not her real name, but one day, she was a very poor woman. One day she felt unwell, as Katerina said, and she started bleeding, and she bled a lot, and then she went to the hospital, and at the hospital, the doctor accused her of killing her son. She didn't even know she was pregnant. And the next thing she knew, she was in jail, and she was condemned to 8 years. For killing her son. So she was actually in jail for 2 years, and then a very, very, very big women's movement get her out of jail, get the judges to liberate her. And the journalist wrote this book that is called Somos Belén, We Are All Belén, telling this story. And the book, as you can see, has a prologue by Margaret Atwood, who was very interested in this whole story. You can see the influence of Margaret Atwood in our movement, our women in Buenos Aires, on one of these Green Tuesdays. But also, maybe you know this or not, Margaret Atwood told that the Housemaid Tale was inspired by the Argentine dictatorship crimes, because the Argentine dictatorship kidnapped the babies from the mothers. So she said that inspired her book. So when the book about the land was presented, this man, who was at that time the president-elect, he's our president now, and he said that he would try to impulse the abortion law to pass, because in 2018, the movement was really, really, really huge, but the Senate rejected the bill. So we had a big, big movement, but not the law still. So remember those signs I show you on black and white from 1984? This one is from, I think it's 2019, and she says, if you think I'm too young to use the green scarf, picture me giving birth, forced to give birth, giving birth by force. And this comes because we have a lot of stories of very, very young girls who usually suffered rape and who were forced to, keep with their pregnancies and give birth. And there's a story of one of those who was called Lucia. Of course, it's not her real name. She was 11 years old and she was raped inside her house by the partner of her grandmother. And then she said to her mother, she said, when she knew she was pregnant, she said, I want out that thing that the old man put in me. So the mother took her to the hospital, and that was a legal abortion at the moment, because since 1921, I mean, a century ago, we had legal abortion for cases of rape or a risk for the health of the woman, which was the case, of course, because this girl was 11. But the mother took her to the hospital, and the hospital literally kidnapped the girl. They put her on a bed, and they wouldn't let her go, and the weeks were passing, so pregnancy was going on, and the director of the hospital would visit her every day and told her about how beautiful her baby was, and how a family would adopt that baby. Well, I'm sorry, this is very moving for me. I have a daughter who's 9, and I cannot even think about this. So finally, I mean, and as Ekaterina was telling, the same, doctors were very scared. I mean, because it's a very Catholic province in the north of Argentina, and the whole power was against this abortion, and there was people on the door of the hospital manifesting against abortion. So doctors were very scared. So finally, a couple of doctors, they are married, obstetricians, they performed the abortion. It was pretty late already. It was like 30, I don't know. It was pretty late. So this couple, they were prosecuted and criminal justice. They had this cause now, still now. So this is what moved this campaign that was called Girls Not Mothers, Girls Not Mothers. And it was a huge debate in Argentina. There was people saying that girls have mother instinct at 11. Okay, well. So these are the girls I wanted to talk about. These are the pioneers that have been every National Women Meeting since the 80s or since the 70s. These are some of them, of course. This is Nina Brugo, she's almost 80. This is Marta Rosenberg, she's 80. Dinali Minchersky, she's 92. She's a lawyer, she's a family lawyer. She fought for divorce, and then for shared custody, and then for abortion. And you can see them, they were literally dancing at that point and singing with the girls on the streets. You can see them all in green. Nelly Menchersky there, she has glitter on her cheeks. Just, glitter, like I'm putting some on my cheeks now. That's what we used when we were on the streets, okay? Just to look more green and more bright, all of us, and she was there. And also she was there on 30 December inside the Congress. This is inside the Congress. This is the moment when the law was finally approved. It says approved here, and this is Nelly here. She was there all the time. So this is Nina with glitter, okay? These are the girls who were looking at the screen. They were on the street. This was like 4 a.m. Okay, they were all on the streets. This some art on the hangers, because the hangers are a symbol of clandestine abortion, because it says that some people who are really desperate could use a hanger to try abortion. Bye-bye hangers, it says there. So. So this is how international this movement was. This is Spain. This is Barcelona. This is, of course, Berlin, Rome, Paris. This is Santiago de Chile, Brazil, Sao Paulo, aborto legal. This is Japan. This is Mexico. This is the map where you could see the pañuelazos all around. The flyers. Oh, and this, I took it myself when I was in Toronto in 2017. Of course, it's not the real Justin, but I know he shares my feelings. So, so we got our law finally, law number 26710. And I have a sister who's an artist, and she sent me another t-shirt. She sent me this t-shirt. Can you see? It says, it's a law, because this one says it's gonna be law, and the new one says it's a, well, this is Nina, all in green, Nina Gruber, almost 80 years old. But you know, this fight has not ended, it's just starting. We need more rights, and also there's other countries who need legal abortion. This woman is Mon Laferte. She's a singer, very well known. She's at the Grammy ceremony in 2019, and she's in topless saying, in Chile, they torture and they rape and they kill. And this is a piece that came out when we got our law in December. It says, today Argentina, tomorrow Peru. And I'm just trying to show that Latin America felt energized when Argentina got the law. We are the third country in Latin America and Caribbean to get this law. The first was Cuba, then Uruguay, Guyana, and then us. So it's very important regionally. And in Chile, there were things moving and the Congress, and in Colombia and in Mexico, they have the law. It's legal, but only in 2 cities, in Mexico City and in Oaxaca. So it's moving. But also, Latin America is going to be all feminist. There's one of the songs the girls sing. It says, "Watch out, sexist. Latin America is going to be all feminist." But still, we have very, very serious situations in the region. For instance, in Honduras, the abortion is absolutely banned, forbidden, even if the woman's health is at risk, or even if the woman's life is at risk, or even if she was raped. In El Salvador, there's tons of women that are in jail for miscarriages. Also, there's a story of one of them who was in jail and she was cancer and she wasn't treated and she died, and now her children are orphans. This story, she knows how to read and write. So it's so unfair. It's about, as Ekaterina said, it's not only reproductive justice, it's justice. And in Argentina, we say it's social justice, which is a very important concept here for us. So thank you very much for having me, and yeah, it's gonna be law for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcela. That was incredibly moving. We're going to move on to Kerri now.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Thank you to the organizers for organizing this panel. I just want to reiterate, really, I had chills going up and down my arm hearing some of those stories. It's really inspirational for us here, especially in New Brunswick. We're still going through the struggle for abortion access, which I'm going to talk about. But the first thing I'm going to ask is, I'm going to start my presentation with a question. And the question is, what's a mild-mannered professor like me doing being threatened by our sergeant at arms at the New Brunswick legislature and having my tent dragged off the lawn of the grounds one September night? And that, as they say in TV, just before they go through a series of flashbacks, it's a long story. So I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell here and tell you a wee bit about that story. So I'll start my little slideshow here. That's me. I like women's rights and constitutional interpretation. I'm usually a dweeby professor that's hanging out in the library, but not in September of 2020. So in September 2020, I heard that our lone provider of abortion services in Fredericton was going to close down. And the reason it was going to close down is that we are the only province in Canada that here in New Brunswick that doesn't fund abortions that are performed in clinics. And we have 3 hospitals that provide abortions, 2 in Moncton, 1 in Bathurst, nothing in Fredericton. So I got mad about that. I know that one of my students that recently graduated had also camped out on the lawn of the legislative grounds to protest. So we got together and decided that we'd do round 2 to essentially have a vigil for the closing of Clinic 554, which is our reproductive health clinic here, provider of abortion services here in Fredericton. So one fine Friday afternoon, we thought we'll set up the tents, we'll have a little vigil that night, we'll stay over, we'll maybe get some attention for the fact that the clinic is closing, protest regulation 8420, that is the regulation that precludes funding. Reproductive Justice New Brunswick is our advocacy group. They've been doing excellent advocacy for years, and I'm a consultant or an advisor with them, but they heard of our plan and decided to have a little event that evening, a vigil. So that's me with Ruth Bader Ginsburg stuck right on the tent. Here I am, all happy. You know, we're going to have a nice little quiet event here. And, you know, things went on. We had our vigil. We candlelight vigil, as you can see, lots of young people in the crowd, lots of law students here. You know, writing little signs, protest chalk marks on the legislative grounds here. But what should happen? But the Sergeant at Arms came and decided in the middle of our candlelight vigil to bust up our protest. So our tents got hauled off. It looks more striking on the news, let me tell you. But they said that they had the authority to do that. We subsequently found out that there's no such authority. So this was unlawful action. Myself and Karen Perlston, who I think is in the audience today, were squeaking at them that they were violating our charter rights, but that didn't seem to cut much ice. But as luck would have it, and sometimes luck is on your side in these things, a bunch of reporters were cooling their heels at the bar across the street because the criminal trial they were covering had adjourned that day. So they beetled over to say what was going on there. So we got tons and tons of press for the actions of the government, for our cause, which was Regulation 8420. And the momentum just carried on the next day. So here's my husband holding my little sign saying, "Keep your hands off my uterus and my tent." And Karen Perlston, again, my colleague from the Faculty of Law, addressing the crowd here. Lots and lots of press. That's some press that I did here. So we continued on protests all the next day. And on Sunday, we had a bit of protest yoga. So that was a first for me. A colleague's little child, a budding feminist, was there with me. So how'd I get there? So I wanted to talk just a wee bit about the history of abortion rights and the Reproductive Justice New Brunswick campaign, as they call it on Twitter, Acts 8420. So I'm going to shut down my screen here so you can see me. And I'll give you some highlights and lowlights. And I thought when I was preparing my comments today, I don't want you to come away thinking, oh, this is so depressing. I'm so depressed by this. And I'm glad to see that my fellow panelists kind of had the same idea, that it's been about what we can do and some of the things to inspire us and to galvanize us into action. And I'm not depressed. I might be annoyed, I might be pissed off, but I still am really hopeful about reproductive rights in our province. It's looking like our best hope is going to be with the courts. But what I really, really hope that you come away with is a sense that every individual has a contribution to make to what I call the constitutional culture. So I'm a constitutional law prof. I kind of see myself as a hammer and everything's a nail. So I look at it through a constitutional law lens. But what I mean by that constitutional scholar or constitutional culture is that when political scientists have looked at our judiciary, what they found, especially post-charter, is that courts are never too far behind or too far ahead of what the societal perspectives are on constitutional rights. So judges aren't separate from our culture, they're a part of that culture. And what looks like common sense to a court on a constitutional issue really is to a great extent dependent on the perspectives held in the larger culture. And we saw this, we've seen this in Canada time and time again. If you look at the way the court has changed its mind on things like medical assistance in dying, same-sex marriage, and indeed reproductive rights as well. So I want you to think about what contribution you can make to the constitutional culture of Canada. And so I'm going to start by talking about the Supreme Court of Canada Morgentaler decision in 1988. And of course, many of us that are listening here know that that's where our criminal law concerning abortion was struck down. It was struck down for violating women's security of the person, as the legalists say, in a manner that didn't accord with fundamental justice, contrary to Section 7 of our charter. But I've looked at this case, God knows how many times, maybe 20, 30 times, and the splits of the court are really, really telling for what happened after that decision. So you had a majority that essentially ruled that the criminal provision was bad because of procedural reasons, because it put the decision about whether a woman obtains her abortion in the hands of a therapeutic abortion committee with a couple of doctors, couldn't be the doctor of the woman seeking the abortion. So this violated their security of the person. It was a bad process that caused delay, that in many cases meant that women weren't able to access abortion at all when their health was threatened, which was the criteria by which they could access. So that was the majority. Bad procedure, bad on procedural grounds because it violated women's physical integrity. It created psychological stress. Now, Justice Wilson, Bertha Wilson at the time, she was the lone woman on the court. So she concurred in the result, but she ruled in a very different way. And she ruled that because the decision because the law took the decision out of the woman's hands, that was a violation of her liberty. And she said that in substance, it was fundamentally unjust for a law to do that. So she ruled on the substance of fundamental justice. It was fundamentally unjust. Wasn't a procedural issue. You can't fix it based on procedure. It's just bad. So this was really, really significant. It was significant for many reasons, but at the time the charter was drafted and enacted, there was a big question about whether or not Section 7 and security of the person would have something to say about abortion. It was entirely unclear. And in fact, the dissent in Morgentaler leans into that and says, you know, the Minister of Justice at the time the charter was created said, no, this absolutely won't apply. So, you know, there's no right to abortion here in the Canadian Charter. What is also significant is the court didn't touch equality rights, as we all know. And this was a right that was claimed by the doctors involved in the courts below, but it was abandoned by the time it reached at the Supreme Court. So the decision was quite groundbreaking at the time. I was a young teenager. I remember feeling this sense of relief when the decision came down. And although it was groundbreaking, who laid the ground was years and years of women's unpaid work contributing to this change in the human rights culture of Canada. seeing reproductive rights as human rights, as constitutional rights. But the Supreme Court of Canada adjudicated the case on the most conservative basis possible. And I think it was, this was such a controversial issue at the time. They thought if we can do it on a really conservative basis, let's go with that. And perhaps that will kind of, make things, quell over a bit. But so the decision strongly suggested that there was very little room for governments to restrict access. But if you look at the decision, you can't say that it provides an absolute bar. That's because of the nature of the claim. It related to criminal law. It didn't relate to regulation of abortion. It concerned Section 7 security of the person, not liberty and not equality. And it was on the basis of a bad process rather than the law being fundamentally unjust in its substance. So yeah, in 1988, that law was struck down. But when people say that there has been no abortion law since 1988, it's important to recognize that that means there is no federal abortion law since 1988. The federal government has criminal jurisdiction. Provinces have jurisdiction over hospitals, over professional regulation of doctors, and payment for medically necessary services. So the maritime provinces took that small crack in the Morgentaler door and they ran with it. And I'm going to talk primarily about New Brunswick for time purposes, and that's the jurisdiction I'm more familiar with. So prior to Morgentaler, the New Brunswick province interpreted the criminal code provisions really restrictively in terms of the criteria of health. So therapeutic abortion committees who were tasked with approving abortions interpreted that risk to health very narrowly. It took doctors to task and required heightened expertise for them, even though performing abortions usually don't require an OB/GYN. It's a relatively simple procedure if you're trained in it. And it had regulations deeming it professional misconduct for doctors to perform surgical abortions outside hospitals. And it excluded abortions from Medicare coverage unless it was approved by 2 doctors and performed by an OB/GYN specialist in a hospital. And those regulations in New Brunswick remained intact even after Morgentaler in 1988. And if you take a longer perspective on abortion access in New Brunswick, there was a Royal Commission report that noted in 1974, there are 5 hospitals that performed abortions in New Brunswick and about 440 hospital abortions performed that year. Now, fast forward, 40 years later, let's look at 2019. There were 3 hospitals, so 2 less, performing abortions in New Brunswick, 2 in the same city, and less hospital abortions performed. So about 10 less than there were in 1974. Now, at the same time, our population has grown by about 100,000. And of course, in 2019, abortions have been completely decriminalized for 30 years. So certainly part of the reason for that decline in numbers of hospital abortions is that New Brunswick government covers the abortion pill, mifegammiso. There is about 700 prescriptions, give or take, for that in 2019. And it's interesting because our government and the aunties that have had their ear for some time are using that figure to suggest that surgical abortions now are a niche procedure. They don't mention the fact that there's a very small window when that abortion pill can be used. And also almost all the prescriptions for that pill are coming from the same hospitals performing abortions. So issues concerning great distances that women need to travel and access aren't solved by mifegammiso. So filling that gap as well was our reproductive health clinic, Clinic 554. I showed you a picture of it. And it provides not only abortion services, but really a full suite of reproductive health services, including the only center for trans healthcare in the province, which also served Prince Edward Island. So Clinic 554 has a pretty interesting history. It started as a Morgentaler clinic in '93 and remained a Morgentaler clinic until his death in 2013. When he died, feminist activists had to crowdfund to keep the clinic going. And that was because, again, Regulation 8420 had restrictions for funding abortions outside of hospitals. So in 1993, Nova Scotia had their very similar regulations about, having professional misconduct, charges brought against doctors, excluding clinic abortions from Medicare funding. The Supreme Court struck those down as saying that they violated the division of powers. They were essentially trying to make criminal restrictions on abortion like the ones that were struck down in Morgentaler. The court said, no go on that. You're violating the division of powers. We're striking those down. Now you'd think that that would have an impact because our regulations here in New Brunswick were almost identical. And Morgentaler applied it to the New Brunswick courts and got the regulation concerning doctor misconduct struck down in '95. But still, like this undead zombie, the funding restriction for clinic abortions continues to stagger on. And women have had to pay out of pocket for abortions at Clinic 554, although I should say notionally so, because Dr. Morgentaler subsidized the operations of the clinic because they were taking in women that couldn't afford abortions, and some estimate that he did so to the tune of about $1 million over the years. So that's what Dr. Morgentaler did for us. So he commenced new litigation to challenge the funding provisions in 2002. And anyone that's litigated against the government, you know that it's a war of attrition. They're going to drag you on. They're going to make you spend money. And that's exactly what they did. So it took about 7 years of procedural wrangling for the court to finally say, yes, Dr. Morgentaler, you have standing to bring this case. Now, only a few years later, he died. So the litigation died with him. So as you can see, regulation in 8420 has stayed in place due to government inertia, or you could even say kind of malice towards women's reproductive rights. It stayed in place because of women's lack of access to justice. I say if you're gonna litigate against the government, you have to be loaded for bear. You have to have a big war chest. You need to have a big infrastructure to back it up. And until recently, we didn't have access to this. And it's important to note that it's not a conservative versus liberal issue. Yes, when we had a liberal government, they tweaked a little bit to eliminate the 2-doctor rule. So not only did you have to have your abortion performed in a hospital, you had to have 2 doctors that agreed with it. So the Liberals did away with the 2-doctor rule, but the funding restrictions remained in place. So 2018, we got back a conservative government and they leaned into the access to justice problem with a vengeance. They thumbed their nose at activists. They told us if we didn't like Regulation 8420, take us to court. And they were banking on us not having the wherewithal to do that. And I would say as a side note, and I can talk to you more about this, it's obviously unconstitutional. I'm a constitutional law scholar, I think I can say it. And the government tries to deny those logical and legal arguments by saying we've provided enough access. We want to defend the system against privatized medicine. We're concerned with women's health and safety. We've debunked all those lame excuses. But still they continue to be repeated. So what do you do when logic is on your side, when the law is on your side, but that doesn't seem to move the government. You're left with litigation, and you're left with getting the people on your side and bringing attention, hence the tents. So, and it's interesting because when you have a government that doesn't listen to law or reason, they're bound to make what I call, and a sporting term, unforced errors, like dragging our tents off when they didn't have the right to do that. So they're acting unlawfully, and it brings their tactics into vivid relief. So Interstage Left, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, they're going to be challenging Regulation 8420 on a pro bono basis. The feds have stepped up a little bit. They clawed back some of the transfer payment under the Canada Health Act for our province's failure to ensure accessibility of abortion services. And I mean, not a lot. It's almost the least they could do. They clawed back $140,000, representing women's out-of-pocket expenses for going to Clinic 554. And perhaps most importantly, the media is now onto them. So they're putting the lie to these crass, ridiculous, hypocritical statements that allowed Clinic 554 to close. And unfortunately, it has closed now. This idea that they didn't want to fund clinic abortions because they care about women's health. And now we have stories coming out showing that the media is really putting the lie to those claims. The story 2 weeks ago was a woman who had abdominal pain since elementary school. She had to go to a user pay private OBGYN clinic to get a diagnosis of polycystic ovarian disease, easily diagnosed, easily treatable, couldn't get that kind of care in New Brunswick. This past week, it was a case of a woman with a prolapsed uterus, and she was literally told by healthcare professionals that would have to completely fall out to be treated. And some professionals even suggested that she engage in self-help and try to push her own uterus back up into herself. So that's the state of reproductive health care. Unfortunately, the advocacy efforts weren't enough to prevent Clinic 554 from closing, but our JMB continues to fight for axing 8420. And what success we've seemed to have so far is the change in the constitutional culture, that all of this is unconstitutional. It's unequal access based on healthcare, it's unequal access to healthcare based on gender, and it's all connected. So I guess the bottom line for me is law and litigation alone won't be what wins this. Winning needs activism, it needs the attention and concern of the whole community, and it needs all of us to shine a spotlight. That's it. Sorry, I went too long, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kerri. I think there are a lot of really interesting resonances and conversations to be had among the three presenters and the cases that they've offered us. So I want to start the conversation by asking the panelists if you have comments or questions for each other.
Wasn't expecting that, Lise.
Well, yeah, I wasn't expecting that, but I can say that it's very interesting for me to see how these issues are repeated with their different situations, but same problems, especially with the Katarina, with the situation in Ireland, which is really very similar at some points with the objection, conscious objection, you said, I think, which is a big deal here in Argentina too. So that shocked me. I knew, of course, I knew about Ireland's situation, but not so much, and it was very illustrative for me. Thank you.
Katerina?
Yes, I also don't have specific questions, but I wanted just to maybe say something around organizing for this referendum, because a lot what Marcela talked about, you know, like ordinary people going to streets and all these actions, this happened a lot in Ireland too. So it was not like, you know, for example, when I talked about civil society organizing, that's really just, for example, abortion rights campaign, that's one of the biggest civil, maybe one, yeah, maybe not the biggest, I'm not sure. I don't want to say it's the biggest and it's not, but one of the very influential organizers who were participating in organizing for this repeal of the 8th Amendment. This initially it was just some people who met in a room and decided to start this campaign, and then they reached more and more people. And so a lot of these dynamics, which was presented by Marcela also in relation to arts and so on, was fully present in Irish context. But I was just a little bit surprised, but you know, in Argentina, the discussion is more about women dying. And this, I didn't see this in Ireland. In Ireland, it's more like, you know, this extreme, it's more the hypocrisy of the state, which basically after 92 tells people, if you want abortion, go elsewhere. In Ireland, you cannot get abortion. So this exportation, you know, you export the problem elsewhere and you don't have to deal with it. This was very strong, but also, you know, sort of a compassion for extreme cases, like also for girls who get pregnant out of rape, or women who are forced to carry babies to term just to see them die as they are born, you know, this type of scenarios, which dominate maybe Irish landscape. I don't know for what reasons, but I think the difference might be important to understand in terms of, like, you know, how you organize and what is the important message that you want to send and what will be the outcome. But that was an interesting difference that I observed. But beyond that, no, I don't have anything to say, but it was very interesting to listen to these different experiences.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's very important. This, well, of course, now it's so easy to speak with people from different countries. But when I was preparing the talk, I was reading about all this movement and how it was inspired by other countries' movement. And I'm not sure if I said it finally, but the whole help and support network was heavily inspired by Women in Waves. You know, it's a very important movement from the Netherlands that puts these boats outside the country, so people who couldn't get an abortion in their countries, they can get on the boat and get the abortion and then go back to their countries. So for me, it's very interesting and very inspiring how a movement in somewhere could inspire another movement in some other place. And that's what, I mean, in Argentina, we have a very big conscious of that regarding the whole Latin America region that is going on very well. So it's interesting what you tell me. It's a good input. Thank you.
I just encourage the attendees to pose questions in the Q&A. But there's a question I think that relates to the conversation we've just been having, which is for Ekaterina. And the question is, what did the internet and social media play a role in mobilizing public opinion to vote yes in the 2018 referendum?
Yeah, so the simple answer is yes, but you know, it's very interesting to try to understand dynamics, how that worked and what didn't work, you know. And this is still, you know, it's still in a process. Like, there are some articles published on this, there are some researchers working on these issues. So I don't think we still have a full picture of why it worked and what exactly worked on social media. Because, you know, there's also very interesting research already performed, which tries to see how different people were targeted by different messages on social media, because especially with Facebook or YouTube, you know, you can have different messages which will be targeted on different people depending on their usage. And in that regard, there was interesting information about how some websites or something like, I don't understand very well how this all works, but something which is not in Ireland, but tries to target Irish users of the internet with certain advertising campaigns and some fake accounts, you know, and these fake accounts mostly are associated with anti-choice campaigns. And so it's really an interesting topic. So while I can say, yes, it played a role, but for example, when I was during this period watching YouTube, on my YouTube videos, the all advertisements which were coming up were from the against the choice campaign, because maybe they have more money to place this advertisement everywhere, I don't know. But that was something which I observed personally. But yeah, definitely yes, but we still have to maybe understand better why and how exactly. Yeah.
There's a question for Kerri. If judges aren't far behind ahead of the general public on constitutional issues, does this mean we should continue being as loud and public as possible regarding equality and reproductive rights to ensure that we remain part of the public discourse? Do you believe this makes a significant impact on subsequent judicial decisions?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask judges, oh, no, we're totally objective. We don't consider anything like that. But I mean, again, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, we should be, you know, speaking directly to judges or trying to influence them, but they're products of the society. And in fact, that's why they're appointed. They're appointed because they've been a member of that, you know, community for X amount of years. And yeah, so I think definitely, and in fact, you know, I am a person that not only publishes, but I speak to our media. I'm active on Twitter, speaking of social media. And the reason I do that is because I really try to walk that walk and do try to influence that constitutional culture. I'm convinced that that's the key to us moving forward here in New Brunswick, which is kind of the canary in the coal mine. I mean, if New Brunswick can have those restrictions, who's to say when you get a conservative government somewhere else that they'll try it? I mean, there is just a private member's bill in Parliament about sex selective abortions to try to get that to be a wedge issue. So they're not going, you know, the antis aren't going to give up. They're going to be constantly trying to push back against those gains. So we have to be there with our own messaging, showing the connection between reproductive justice and constitutional rights, certainly.
Marcela, I think we were all really inspired by, you know, this amazing grassroots mobilization in Argentina. And there's a question that relates to it. Was it common to suffer stigma or discrimination from family members or employers if you participated in the abortion rights movement?
I'm sorry. Well, I guess it depends a lot on well, in which sphere are you moving, and in which sphere do you live? I mean, as I told you, this movement was so huge that there were very, very, very different people on the streets. In my sphere, it was the most common thing to do, to have the green scarf and to support this movement. And also something that happened is that different generations started to say, okay, I will support this. First, my mother say, she always was pro-choice by herself, but she would never support this publicly. But at some point, the discussion boiled up so much that, well, yes, the most people I know that I work with or my family, we didn't need to know that we were all pro-choice. But I know I have friends who had, yes, problems with their families because, well, I'm not Catholic person, but this is a Catholic country. So yes, there were families where there were a lot of conflicts with that. And also the same legislators said in Congress that they changed their minds because their own daughters or their own family talked to them and told them how important this was and how it was important for the safety and the health of women and the freedom of women. There was more than one legislator that said that had in the past voted against, but would vote for this time, and it was only 2 years, from 2018 to 2020, because a daughter had talked to him and he had understood. And not only men, also women. We have a vice president here, who was before our president for 8 years. She was the president from, I think, 2007, 2015, and she was against the abortion, and she had said that publicly. But this time, she was for the abortion. And some people could say this was because she saw that it was convenient for her, like for the votes. But she says that her daughter talked to her and she understood it was very important for women. So that's how cultural changes happen, right? With generations moving and talking to each other. So I know some people had problems with their families at work. I had the privilege to go to the manifestation with my boss, my female boss. Not everyone was so lucky as I was.
There's a question that any of you could answer, and it's about the role that conscientious objection is playing in sort of the anti-choice struggle. And I should say that here in Alberta last year, there was an effort to pass a private members bill that would have allowed for conscientious objection, which is already allowed through professional regulation. But this bill would have enabled health providers to refuse to provide referrals. Thankfully, it did not make it onto the floor of the legislature. LEAF Edmonton was among a number of groups who struggled against this private members bill. But so I know that you spoke about it specifically. I think that there is provision in your legislation around conscientious objection, but could you all maybe talk about the role that conscientious objection could play in restricting access? So I'll start with Katerina, because you spoke about it specifically.
So in Ireland, first of all, it's allowed, but the law says that the medical practitioner has to refer the person to another practitioner. So but this does create definitely delays, especially for the abortions in the first trimester abortion, so up to 12 weeks. Because imagine with the referral, it means that person has to attend another practitioner. Then after the person attends the practitioner and the practitioner certifies that it's within 12 weeks, the person has to wait 3 days. And so it all adds up. And again, remember my point about geographic accessibility, because here the general practitioners can opt in the service. And so some are on the list, some are not. So, and the person doesn't necessarily approach the GP who is on the list. And then the hospitals, there are also hospitals who opted out of the list, so, which means very long travels, plus three waiting days. But this also creates complications for the cases where there's risk to health and life, because for risk to health, the abortion is permitted if there's serious risk to health, if the fetus is not viable without serious supporting measures. And so the more time goes, the more it becomes possible to ascertain that, yes, the fetus will be viable, and so abortion becomes impossible. So it's also an obstacle for these types of cases. And definitely it's issue which is signaled by, for example, abortion rights campaign as a problematic which needs to be addressed. But so far, I think, it's too optimistic to see it really addressed in Irish context.
Thanks, Ekaterina. Kerri, has there been any movement in New Brunswick on the anti-choice side to pass conscientious objection legislation?
I don't believe so. And I mean, I looked recently at the Code of Ethics for doctors here, and there's a vague reference to if doctors have some sort of conscientious objection to providing any service, that they're to make a referral. So it's not as precise as I would like, but of course, in every province, the situation is different because it's a provincial responsibility. And Ontario just had a case decided indicating that the Code of Ethics there that requires an effective referral. So you have to make sure that the person that you're referring your patient to will provide the service. That was upheld, and because some anti-choice doctors took a run at it to say that, well, it violates their freedom of religion to provide an effective referral, it makes them complicit, and the court was having none of that argument. So that was, I think, although it's an Ontario decision, I think that's a good precedent for us.
Marcela, has there been any movement around this in Argentina?
Well, until December, abortion was still illegal. So some doctors, of course, would do it, but it was clandestine. Since we had the law that was actually, official in January, 24 January, the law has the legal figure of conscientious objection for individuals, but not for institutions. So if you run a clinic, you must provide the service of abortion. Even if your clinic has a name like Saint whatever, you must provide that service to get your license, okay, to keep your license. And of course, that goes also for public health institutions. I say that because in Argentina, we have public health and private health. And usually middle class and upper class would use private health, not public health. But at some issues, public health is much more progressive. That happens. So this law goes to all of them and say, okay, you can have your private clinic and do whatever you want to do inside the law, but the law says that you have to provide this service up to week 14 of pregnancy, and if an individual refuses because of beliefs, okay, but the clinic has to do it. Otherwise, that clinic would be shut down. And also, the government provides a telephone line call if you can't find a clinic to perform the abortion, because that could happen. As Ekaterina said, Argentina is a very big country with very widespread population. So you don't always have so many medical facilities to choose. So if you are in an area where the first place you go, they refuse, and the second they refuse, you can call to that line. I still don't know if it's really working, because that's the letter of the law. And also with the pharmacies where you should be able to buy misoprostol, I read that they are not really available everywhere as they should, but you could denounce the pharmacy. Say, okay, they are not selling this, and they should, because it's in the law. So the law is very nice. We are still checking out how it's really working in the real life, but I haven't read in the last month. I mean, it's very new. We are in April and this was January, but I haven't read about real problems obstaculizing people the right to abortion up to week 14.
Thank you. Ekaterina, I was going to ask you about, in Canada, the Supreme Court has consistently affirmed the live birth rule. So the fetus doesn't have legal status or legal entitlements in Canadian law. I was wondering about the legal status of the fetus in Irish law.
So now it's not the same as before, because before the 8th Amendment was repealed, as I showed you, that this really was the right to life of the unborn, which was equal to the right to life of the woman. And I tried to show it was even more so, because the reality showed that it was more important. Like, once somebody becomes pregnant, it's just, you are not a person anymore. You are just a carrier of this new life, and that's the life which ultimately needs protected. Now this text which I showed you, which was the part of the Constitution, now it's repealed. And so the Constitution basically says that the legislation, so the Parliament can legislate about abortion. So it's different now. But up until very recently, that was really right to life of the unborn, which was constitutionally protected. And that's the whole difficulty of this struggle in Ireland, because you had to change this constitutional provision before you could legislate about anything. So it wasn't like in Argentina, just about the law, it was about constitutional change. And that's why we have this history of successive referenda around this issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Kerri, I was wondering maybe you could talk a little bit more about the CCLA challenge and the status of the challenge.
Sure. So right now, kind of like Morgenthaler's litigation before, they're involved with a standing application. So that is going to be happening in early May for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association to be granted standing to move the litigation forward. That's always an issue with respect to reproductive litigation, is finding litigants who are willing to do it, because either the government will try to satisfy the individual claim so that the bigger claim doesn't go forward, or you know, there's still a certain degree of stigma attached. There's a certain amount of stress that goes along with being you know, the litigant. So hopefully we'll get a decision on that in fairly short order, and we'll be able to push ahead. So the claims that are being made are primarily under Section 7, like the Morgenthaler case, but also an equality rights claim as well.
Great, thank you. Marcela, I was when I was listening to you, and all of those wonderful slogans are so compelling, but I wanted to just highlight, you know, the emphasis on sex education and comprehensive sex education to enable reproductive decision making. And pleasure too. I mean, these are really, really wonderful and radical connections, I think. And I just wanted to make some links to the Alberta context, where we have quite a conservative government, and our government has just released a new draft curriculum for elementary school, and so kindergarten to grade 6. And the new draft curriculum specifically is specifically abstinence-based. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about, you know, the connections made during that grassroots mobilization between abortion rights and sex education and pleasure. I think that's really radical and progressive.
Yes, of course. Could you please repeat? You said that in this draft, it was specifically what?
Abstinence-based.
Abstinence,
So
really?
Yes. It
Wow.
says the draft says that the only surefire way to.
You're mute, Liz.
Oh, sorry. The draft says that the only sure way to prevent pregnancy is abstinence.
Amazing.
And it actually talks about contraception as in terms of artificial contraception as well. So
wow. Yeah, I thought that I heard abstinence, but I wasn't really sure. Okay, well, you know, some years ago, I don't remember exactly how many, we got this law on sex education at the national level. And so it wasn't the curricula, but there was a lot of consciousness objection, we could say, from the educational institutions, individuals, and also institutions. A lot of people refused to teach sex education. I mean, the curriculum is pretty good, and it changes everything, and it really changes everything, because we have a lot of problems in Argentina of child abuse and intrafamiliar child abuse. The same girls that then need abortions are the girls that are abused inside of their houses, their homes. So there's a lot of stories registered of teachers and school directors who said that little children, girls and boys also, after the sex education class that is in the whole curricula since kindergarten, of course adapted, right? That children could talk to them later, and I'm sorry, it's very moving, and tell them things that happen at their house, and so they could finally protect those kids that were suffering abuse. So it's really, really very important. And there was also a very big movement against this sex education in all the schools. I haven't spent time talking about the whole against choice movement, because I don't feel like it, but it's a big movement also in Argentina, you know, with the church, and we have the green scarves and they have the blue, light blue scarves, and you can see the pictures if you want. So this has a lot of opposition in the whole society, but of course the church, and it was a position to help the kids to understand when they were being abused. So it's very critical. It's not only about pleasure when you are a teenage, you know, it's much worse. It's about abuse and then rape. So it's very, very critical, and it's complicated. And also this kind of sex education talks about diversity, you know, gender diversity. So that was another critical point. A lot of people didn't like that and was against. But of course, it's very much related. It all ties together. It's all about expanding rights, and of course, sex education is very important, not only in practical terms to know what you're doing and try not to get pregnant, first of all, but also to understand. I mean, sex education in Argentina starts trying to dismantle gender roles, stereotypical gender roles. Start there. So it's a big whole thing, a very good big whole thing, and still we are all fighting to get that actually working, you know, because as I told you, there's a lot of people who really doesn't like very much this, and they had this campaign that was called "Not with my kids," like don't throw your ideological garbage to my kids, and the point is they are not your kids exactly, they are people, and they need to know about their rights and hopefully how not to be abused. So it was a very, very big thing here, and was part of this sequence, I think, that led to this law, and that doesn't stop here. Some of the girls used to say, this is not a roof, we are starting here. I mean, roof, how I say, okay, this is a starting point for more rights. That's the idea.
I'm mindful of the time, and I was just wondering if any of the panelists had some last words. I think this has just been an incredible conversation, which I think reminds us all that we can't be complacent, and that we can learn a lot from having these global conversations. But I'll just ask the panelists if they have any final words.
support us. Go on Twitter and retweet the stuff that Reproductive Justice New Brunswick is doing. You can help us from afar because it's really important that people see that, you know, the eyes of the nation are watching and are judging when, you know, our government is doing ridiculous things. So that would be a helpful thing for Edmontonians, Albertans, Canadians to do, you know, people across the world even.
Thanks, Kerri. Marcela, do you have any final words?
Yes, well, elaborating on what Kerri said, it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of countries where, there are no justice for women, really. Abortion is banned. There are, all kinds of abuses, especially in America at this moment. In Honduras and in El Salvador is very tragic, the situation, but still we have a lot of injustice for women, and it's good to be with eyes open to that and trying to support. And my last word would be thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Katerina?
I just wanted maybe to highlight that Irish example perhaps demonstrates that every time we win something, we at the same time realize that it's not enough and that there's another battle coming. So it's a continuing process. And this sort of type of conversations will need to continue in the future too. So thanks also for making me part of this.
Well, thank you, everyone. I wanted to thank you all on behalf of LEAF Edmonton. It's been a really interesting and illuminating discussion. I think we can all learn from each other, and I think that it's important for us to continue to have these conversations. So I wanted to thank everybody, all of the attendees for being with us on Equality Day, and thank you for your engagement through the Q&A. So thank you all, and have a great day. It's a beautiful day here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.